The canvas seems benign at first glance, a cherubic child swathed in luxurious silks, her cheeks flushed like any other 6-year-old's. But peer closer. Notice the way the folds of fabric strain against her body, the artist's brush lingering on her swollen limbs, her thickened neck. This is no ordinary portrait. Painted in 1680 for the Spanish royal court, it hangs today in Madrid's Prado Museum under a title that chills: La Monstrua Desnuda, the Naked Monster. The subject's name was Eugenia Martínez Vallejo. A peasant's daughter. A medical enigma. A child paraded before aristocrats and scholars like a caged beast, her humanity reduced to a single, dehumanizing word: monstrua. Born in 1674 in a rural village, Eugenia's early life was unremarkable until her body began to change. By her first birthday, her weight ballooned inexplicably, her limbs thickening as her face rounded into what chroniclers call a moon-like visage. Modern experts suspect Prader-Willi syndrome, a genetic disorder causing insatiable hunger and rapid weight gain. But in 17th-century Spain, there were no diagnoses, only whispers. To her parents, she was their daughter. To neighbors, she was either a divine omen or a cursed aberration. By 6, she'd become a rumor so potent it reached the ears of a king. Spain's Charles II, himself physically frail and plagued by superstition, summoned Eugenia to Madrid. His court, a gilded world of fading power and morbid fascination, saw her not as a child, but as a wonder of nature. Physicians poked her flesh, measuring folds of skin. Theologians debated whether her body signaled God's wrath or the devil's mark. Artists immortalized her nakedness, framing her with symbols of excess. Ripe fruits, lavish drapery. There was no mercy in their curiosity, no acknowledgement of the girl beneath the spectacle. Yet the paintings tell a haunting contradiction. In one, Eugenia stands nude, her expression eerily vacant. In another, she's clothed in ornate court dress, a costume meant to mock her peasant origins while exaggerating her size. Both works, commissioned by the Crown, straddle the line between scientific record and cruel caricature. For decades after, the images toured Europe fueling laughter and horror. Eugenia herself vanished. The court discarded her as swiftly as it showcased her. What became of her? History offers only silence. No marriage record, no grave, no last words, just the legacy of a label coined by kings. This chapter peels back centuries of voyeurism to ask, who truly wore the mask of monstrosity? The child displayed like an artifact, or the society that sold compassion for spectacle? The village of Burgos, 1674. Nestled in Spain's rugged north, where mist clung to the hillsides and faith clung tighter still, a child was born to a family of dirt-poor laborers. No fanfare greeted her arrival. No scribes recorded her first cries. In a world of backbreaking toil and fleeting lives, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo entered history as countless peasants did, quietly, anonymously, another mouth to feed in a kingdom sliding into decay. But within months, whispers began. At first, her parents swore she was no different from her siblings, a squirming, pink-cheeked infant, hungry and ordinary. Then, her body transformed. By her first birthday, her limbs thickened unnaturally, her face rounded into a moon-like softness, her growth outpacing children twice her age. Neighbors stared. Midwives muttered. In a region steeped in folklore, where miracles and curses walked hand in hand, Eugenia became a riddle. Was this ravenous, swelling child a sign of divine favor? Or a demon's mark? Her parents, desperate to shield her, kept her close. They knew the stories of infants branded witches, of families shunned for birthing changeling children. Yet love, or perhaps denial, softened their fear. To them, she was simply Eugenia, giggling as she toddled, clutching wildflowers, her laughter echoing through their cramped hut. But rural Spain had no room for secrecy. By the time Eugenia turned 3, the rumors had spiraled into legend. Traveling friars spoke of a giantess in Burgos. Merchants carried tales of a girl who devoured food like a grown man. The local priest eyed her with suspicion, questioning whether her body hid a soul worth saving. Modern science suggests Eugenia suffered from Prader-Willi syndrome, a genetic disorder triggering insatiable hunger and weak muscle tone. But in the 17th century, her condition was a cosmic puzzle, one that invited dread, not diagnosis. As her body swelled, so did the village's unease. Mothers crossed themselves when she passed. Children taunted her from a distance. Even those who pitied her could not shake the feeling that she was wrong, a blight on God's orderly creation. Yet within this alienation lay a cruel irony. Eugenia's humble origins, which might have spared her anonymity, instead sealed her fate. When word reached Madrid's decadent court, a place hungry for diversion, her peasant status made her expendable. A curiosity to be bought, displayed, and discarded. A monster ripe for exploitation. Her story begins here, in the dirt and desperation of rural Spain, where compassion withered beneath a harvest of fear. But this child, burdened by flesh and circumstance, would soon become a pawn in a kingdom's grand, grotesque theater, one where royalty dressed their shame in velvet and called it art. In the rural stillness of 17th century Burgos, where life moved to the rhythm of seasons and scripture, a quiet horror began unfolding in a peasant's home. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, a baby born with the same cries and clasping fingers as any other, had begun to change. By 6 months old, her limbs swelled with alarming speed. Her cheeks rounded into doughy mounds, her neck thickened, and her once delicate frame ballooned as if under a spell. By age 2, she could no longer toddle without stumbling. Her body, dense and uncooperative, defied every expectation of childhood. What curse or miracle had taken root in this child? To her parents, Eugenia's transformation was a silent terror. They hid her from prying eyes, praying her condition would stabilize. But in a village where every birthmark might mark a witch and every drought was God's wrath, her body became a battleground of superstition. Some neighbors claimed she'd been swapped by fairies. Others whispered she bore the devil's gluttony, a child consumed by her own hunger, eating not for survival, but as if driven by an invisible scourge. Even the local priest hesitated to bless her, questioning whether her flesh harbored a soul worth saving. Modern medicine would later suggest Eugenia suffered from Prader-Willi syndrome, a genetic disorder causing relentless hunger and metabolic dysfunction. But in an era before chromosomes were understood, her body was a canvas for fear. Obesity, then seen as a moral failing or divine punishment, framed her as monstrous. Yet cruelty intertwined with fascination. Traveling merchants spread tales of the giantess of Burgos, spinning her existence into legend. By the time Eugenia turned 5, her name had reached the ears of Spain's elite, a distraction for a crumbling empire hungry for spectacle. Her parents, trapped between love and survival, faced an impossible choice. Keeping her meant enduring the village's venom. Letting her go might spare her, or condemn her to worse. When royal envoys arrived in 1680, bearing promises of royal patronage, the decision was made for them. Eugenia, just 6 years old, was wrenched from her family and paraded to Madrid, a living oddity for a king's amusement. This chapter of her life closes with dirt roads fading behind her, a child's fate sealed by the very body that should have protected her. Ahead lay velvet drapes and cold curiosity, a court eager to dissect her story. But never her humanity. BY 1680, Spain's once mighty empire was a shadow of itself, bankrupt, plague-ridden, haunted by the ghosts of conquest. King Charles II, just 19 years old and already called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, ruled from a gilded cage of superstition. Frail, with a jaw so deformed he could barely chew, the king harbored a morbid fascination with bodies that defied nature, perhaps seeking solace in others' differences to distract from his own. When whispered tales of a living titan in Burgos reached him, he dispatched riders north. Their orders were simple: bring him the child. Eugenia's parents, though fearful, had little choice. Refusing the crown meant punishment. Compliance might earn a handful of coins. Historians debate whether they wept as they handed over their 6-year-old daughter. Did they believe the court would care for her? Or did they know, deep down, she'd become a prisoner of curiosity? What's certain is this: for a peasant family, survival often meant sacrifice. And Eugenia, who'd already borne the weight of her village's scorn, now bore the ambitions of a desperate king. The journey to Madrid was a parade of indignities. Crowds gathered at every village to gawk at the cart carrying the monstrous girl. Children threw pebbles. Adults crossed themselves. Eugenia, draped in rough-spun cloth, likely shrank from the stairs, or perhaps, by then, numbness had set in. Her world had always been cruel. Why should this be different? Upon arriving at court, she was scrubbed, pruned, and paraded as a marvel. Charles' 2 courtiers, desperate to distract their melancholic king, staged a grotesque unveiling. Physicians squeezed her flesh, measuring folds of skin as if charting territory. Theologians argued whether her form signaled God's displeasure or a test of faith. Nobles laughed behind silk fans, marveling at the peasant child who mirrored their own excesses in distorted form. Yet the bleakest twist lay in the king's reaction. Chroniclers note Charles found Eugenia diverting, but showed no pity. To him, she was a toy, a creature as exotic as his menagerie of dwarves and exotic beasts. In a single audience, Eugenia, fate was sealed. She would not return home. Instead, she'd remain at court, subjected to tests, dressed in ludicrous costumes, her body dissected by gazes instead of scalpels. This chapter closes with Eugenia standing in a hall of mirrors, not of glass, but of human judgment. A child who'd outgrown her village now shrunk beneath the weight of a kingdom's gaze. Ahead awaited brushes and canvas, cages and whispers, as Spain prepared to immortalize its shame. The Hall of Mirrors in Madrid's Royal Alcazar was no place for a child. Yet there, beneath frescoed ceilings dripping with gold leaf, 6-year-old Eugenia stood, stripped to the skin, surrounded by men in powdered wigs and cassocks. Physicians pressed cold hands to her flesh, murmuring weights and measures. Theologians peered into her eyes as if searching for hellfire. Courtiers tittered, their silks rustling like snakes. This was not a medical examination. It was theater. And Eugenia, tiny, bewildered, her body straining against its own limits, was the star of Spain's most grotesque show. King Charles II's court had long blurred the lines between science and spectacle. Fascinated by bodies that defied natural order, the king assembled a menagerie of human curiosities: dwarves, giants, hermaphrodites. But Eugenia was different. Her obesity, a condition both visible and enigmatic, became a riddle to solve. Court physician Francisco Diaz Santos authored a treatise on monstrous births, using her as proof that humoral imbalance could warp the soul. Priests debated whether her size signaled divine wrath or a test of faith, scribbling notes that reduced her to a theological chess piece. Yet the cruelest performance came in the form of art. Painter Juan Correno de Miranda was ordered to capture Eugenia's likeness twice. Once nude, surrounded by ripe fruit symbolizing excess. Once swaddled in courtly finery, a parade, why of nobility. The portraits, displayed in the palace's public galleries, were less about documentation than humiliation. Viewers jeered at the child's exposed body, her face rendered with a vacuous serenity that masked whatever fear or confusion she felt. The clothed portrait, meanwhile, mocked her peasant origins, velvet draping a monstrous form unfit for royal garb. But what did Eugenia understand of her ordeal? Diaries from the period mention her only in passing. The large girl seemed drowsy during sessions. She spoke little, ate much. Modern psychologists suggest such docility may have been trauma, a coping mechanism for a child trapped in a world that ogled but never saw her. Charles II, meanwhile, hosted banquets where nobles dined beneath her paintings, laughing at the contrast between their refined gluttony and hers. This chapter drips with ironies. Theologians who preached charity commodified a child's suffering. Physicians seeking enlightenment deepened her dehumanization. And a king who feared his own body's weakness wielded Eugenia's as a weapon of distraction. By the time the court exhausted its curiosity, she'd served her purpose. A living cautionary tale, a canvas for projection, a thing to be stared at and then discarded. Her paintings remain. But look beyond the brushstrokes, and you'll glimpse a darker masterpiece, one that paints a society's rot in the name of God, science, and entertainment. The T.G. painter's studio reeked of linseed oil and sweat. Eugenia, just 6 years old, sat perched on a velvet cushion, her legs dangling awkwardly. Juan Carreno de Miranda, court painter to King Charles II, adjusted her limp arm, tutting at the way her skin spilled over the fabric. She'd been scrubbed raw for this moment, her hair coiled into curls, her body transformed into a prop. 2 portraits were commissioned. One nude, draped in sheer cloth. Another swathed in finery fit for a queen. But these were not acts of tribute. They were taxidermy with brushstrokes, preserving Eugenia not as a child, but as a marvel. The nude portrait, La Monstrua Desnuda, is a masterclass in calculated humiliation. Eugenia stands against a dark void, her body illuminated like a specimen. Ripe melons and grapes surround her, symbols of excess, a warning against gluttony, though she'd never controlled her cravings. Her face, painted with cherubic softness, stares blankly, as if dissociated from the flesh beneath. The clothed portrait, La Monstrua Vestida, is crueler still. Gowned in brocade and lace, she becomes a parody of nobility, her peasant origins sanded away by satire. The fabric strained at the seams, mocking her body's refusal to conform. Carreno de Miranda, known for pious religious scenes, approached Eugenia with clinical detachment. His brush probed her contours, not to humanize, but to scrutinize. Scholars debate whether the portraits aimed to document or entertain, but their public display reveals the truth. They hung in the Oil Palace's gallery, where nobles gawked and jested. A French diplomat's diary recounts nobles roaring with mirth at the contrast between her finery and form. Yet the paintings hold a haunting duality. Today, preserved in Madrid's Prado Museum, they're praised for their technical mastery, the play of light on fabric, the realism of skin. But technical brilliance masks ethical rot. Eugenia's vacant expression, likely coached by the artist, sanitizes her suffering. She becomes a blank canvas for viewers' projections. Pity, disgust, fascination. History records nothing of her experience during the sittings. Did she cry? Complain of hunger? Attempt to flee? Or had she already learned that resistance was futile? What lingers is the staggering imbalance. A 6-year-old immortalized not for her spirit, but for her body's betrayal. The portraits outlived her by centuries, etching La Monstrua into cultural memory. But in their shadow, Eugenia the child vanished. No diary entries, no gravesite, no last words. Only pigment and shame preserved under varnish. To view them now is to witness a crime framed as art. The freezing of a girl's pain for the pleasure of princes, and the complicity of a brush that cared more for drapery than dignity. The curtains closed on Eugenia Martínez Vallejo's public life as abruptly as they'd opened. After her portraits were completed and displayed, the court ledgers fall silent. No entries note a return to her village. No final payment to her family. No records of illness, marriage, or death. Like a plaything discarded by a bored child, Eugenia vanished, her existence reduced to a few brushstrokes and the echoing laughter of nobles who no longer found her amusing. Historians have combed archives for clues. Did she succumb to health complications from her condition, untreated and unstudied? Was she secreted away to a convent or charity home, her presence too shameful to acknowledge? Some speculate she was quietly returned to Burgos, her parents instructed never to speak of their monstrous daughter again. Others suggest she lingered in the palace's underbelly, a ghost nibbling scraps in shadowed corridors. But these are guesses, desperate attempts to fill the void left by a society that documented her body meticulously, yet erased her humanity entirely. The silence is its own indictment. In an age when even court dwarves and jesters merited passing mentions in diaries, Eugenia's absence from the record screams volumes. Her utility ended the moment her novelty faded. To the crown, she was never a person, only a temporary diversion, a footnote in the king's cabinet of curiosities. When her body ceased to entertain, it ceased to matter. For Eugenia, the aftermath of fame may have been crueler than the spotlight. Stripped of the court's perverse protections, she would have faced a world even less forgiving than before. If she survived into adolescence, her health likely worsened without care. If she returned home, village scorn would have hardened into outright hostility. Yet no scenario alters the core tragedy. A child exploited, then abandoned, her fate deemed unworthy of ink. Her paintings, meanwhile, toured Europe, a posthumous fame she never lived to see. For decades, they were loaned to medical colleges and aristocratic salons, dissected by scholars who wrote of her abnormalities, but never her name. Eugenia became a concept, not a corpse. A lesson, not a life. In the end, her story is one of vanishing twice over. First into the court spectacle, then into history's shadows. The girl who once filled canvases now haunts the blank spaces between lines, a reminder that when spectacle consumes a person, even their disappearance becomes a silent scream. In the candlelit chambers of Madrid's royal court, curiosity festered like an open wound. Spain's 17th-century elite, heirs to a fading empire, sought meaning in the macabre, collecting dwarfs, dissecting cadavers, and flinching at their own reflections. Deformity was not merely a physical trait, it was a language. A hunchback might whisper of divine punishment. A dwarf stature could mock the arrogance of kings. And a child like Eugenia, swollen beyond recognition, became a cipher for every fear gripping a superstitious, crumbling nation. King Charles II, weak-jawed and plagued by seizures, saw his own fragility mirrored in the bodies of others. His court became a sanctuary for the unnatural, not from compassion, but from desperation. Physicians dissected deformed corpses to seek cures for his ailments. Theologians parsed the Bible for signs of God's wrath in crooked spines. Obesity, in particular, symbolized moral failure. Gluttony made flesh, a sin spun into skin. Eugenia's body, then, was a battleground. Was her size a mark of sin, or a test of faith? A medical anomaly, or a court jester's punchline? Spain's golden age had birthed a dark paradox. A society both devout and decadent, where Inquisition fires smoldered alongside lavish masquerades. The Church condemned dissection as sacrilege, yet sanctioned it in service of royal health. Court dwarves like Diego de Acedo, immortalized by Velázquez, were pampered pets, proof of nobility's power to domesticate the strange. But Eugenia, too ungainly to amuse, too grotesque to adorn a salon, could not be gentrified. She was exhibited not as a mascot, but as a memento mori, a reminder that even Spain's might could rot from within. This obsession with the unnatural masked a deeper terror of decline. Plague, bankruptcy, and colonial losses gnawed at the empire's core. By fixating on bodies like Eugenia's, the court transformed collective anxiety into spectacle. Her difference became a scapegoat, a way to say, "We are not the monsters." Yet in their relentless scrutiny, They betrayed their own deformities, a priesthood weaponizing faith, a nobility feasting on suffering, a king so fractured he could only feel whole in the presence of the bro. Ken. Eugenia's tragedy lies not just in her exploitation, but in her inevitability. She was a symptom of a world where power fed on otherness, where science and scripture alike were twisted to dissect souls instead of saving them. To see her story clearly, we must stare into Spain's cracked mirror and confront the shameful hunger that devours what it cannot understand. Beneath the layers of oil paint and velvet, beneath the grotesque caricature of La Monstrua, there was a child. A 6-year-old girl who once chased chickens in a Burgos yard, who clutched her mother's skirts during thunderstorms, who marveled at the taste of figures, but history erased her. In its place, it left a hollow icon, a vessel for shame, science, and scorn. The portraits tell a chilling lie. Juan Carreno de Miranda's brush softened Eugenia's features into vacant passivity, framing her as a docile oddity. Yet surviving accounts hint at flashes of rebellion. Court chroniclers noted she occasionally resisted examination or balked at undressing, moments swiftly suppressed by handlers. These slivers of agency, rare and fragile, reveal a girl straining against the cage of her own body and the cruelty of spectators. But the paintings silence her. They freeze her in perpetuity as an object, stripping her of voice, will, even pain. Modern scholars, armed with DNA analysis and medical hindsight, have begun peeling back the myth. Prader-Willi syndrome, they argue, would have tormented Eugenia with insatiable hunger and weak muscle tone, making movement agonizing. Her docility during court inspections? Likely exhaustion, depression, or the dissociation of a child taught her body was not her own. Even her famed portraits betray clues. The flushed cheeks of cardiac strain, the swollen joints of a body buckling under its own mass. But 17th century observers saw only a moral failing, a monster to dissect with eyes and brushes. The tragedy of Eugenia lies in this theft of personhood. At every turn, her humanity was overridden. Her parents, forced by poverty, surrendered her to a crown that prized spectacle over care. Physicians, blinded by dogma, scribbled notes on her flesh but ignored her suffering. Theologians debated her soul yet denied her compassion. And the public, then and now, fixated on her body's betrayal while forgetting the girl trapped within it. Today, her paintings hang in the Prado, lauded as masterworks of Baroque realism. Crowds still pause, snap photos, murmur judgments. But what if we dared to look deeper? Not at the monster they crafted, but the child they buried. The one who might have loved songs, feared the dark, dreamed of home. The one who never chose satin or nudity, immortality or infamy. Eugenia's story is a plea to see beyond the frame, to recognize that the truest monstrosities are not the bodies we label, but the systems that reduce lives to curiosities. She was never La Monstrua. She was a child. And in forgetting that, we become years of a court that devoured her whole. Gilded frame surrounding Eugenia's portrait in the Prado Museum does more than preserve paint, it holds a plea. For centuries, viewers have approached La Monstrua with the same chilling curiosity that brought nobles to gawk at her in life. Today, however, we stand at a crossroads. Will we perpetuate her exploitation, or finally grant her the compassion history denied? Modern science offers clarity the 17th century lacked. Geneticists analyzing her symptoms, insatiable hunger, rapid weight gain, developmental delays, identify not a monster, but Prader-Willi syndrome, a rare genetic disorder. This revelation reframes her story. The girl deemed a moral failure was, in fact, a child battling a condition beyond her control. The frescoed halls of Madrid's court saw a divine aberration. Contemporary medicine sees a medical reality. Yet even this understanding carries risk, reducing Eugenia, once again, to a diagnosis rather than a person. Her legacy demands more. To remember Eugenia without cruelty means confronting the mechanisms of dehumanization that turned a peasant girl into a myth. It requires re-examining the portraits not as artifacts of freakishness, but as evidence of a society's complicity. When we look at Carino de Miranda's work today, can we see past the spectacle? Can we recognize the fatigue in her eyes, the loneliness in her posture, the child whose voice was stolen by velvet and varnish? This shift is not merely historical, it's urgent. Eugenia's story mirrors modern struggles with body shaming, medical stigma, and the objectification of marginalized lives. Each time we label someone other, we resurrect the court's cruel gaze. But we also hold power they lacked, the choice to redefine her narrative. Activists and historians now petition the Prado to rechristen her portraits, stripping the slur la monstrua from exhibit labels. Scholars emphasize her name, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, insisting she be remembered as more than a diagnosis or a parable. Yet true remembrance lies beyond titles. It lives in acknowledging the humanity her contemporaries erased, the giggle she stifled under scrutiny, the parents who mourned her, the ordinary joys and fears eclipsed by her extraordinary body. To honor her is not to weep for a tragedy centuries cold, but to confront the systems still reducing vulnerable lives to curiosities. Eugenia's painted eyes meet ours across time, not pleading for pity, but demanding accountability. When we call her monster, we absolve the real villains, ignorance, cruelty, and the hunger for spectacle. When we see the child instead, we commit to a world where difference is not a cage, but a mirror showing us who we might become.